At the beginning of our Parsha Pikudei, which is also the last Torah portion in the book of Exodus, Moses does something surprising and a little unusual. After the Mishkan, the tabernacle, has been assembled, he declares, "These are the records of the tabernacle." And then he proceeds to take a public inventory and accounting of every single part of the Mishkan and how much money has been spent in its creation. While sometimes the sages invent stories to give context as to why Moses would do such a strange thing and take up so much of our valuable space in our text to do so, the text itself offers no justification. It seems simply, as many contemporary commentators expound, that Moses understood that being a good leader necessitates transparency and accountability. That even in moments where that transparency isn't being demanded, it is a value to offer it freely. With Moses' words and actions buzzing in my ear this past week, I found myself doing some soul searching and considering the ways that I am going to cry throughout the sermon, I'm just letting everyone know, that I have not been fully transparent with the community, specifically in my relationship and evolving feelings towards the war in Gaza, as the facts on the ground have changed and the war rages on. While I do think I've been skirting around the edges, I have not been as transparent as I could have been or want to be about my struggles, ambivalences, and new understanding of what constitutes for me the potential for safety and security for Israel. So today, channeling the spirit of Moses, who went out of his way to be open with the community, I want to be open and transparent with all of you. I want to be open that I am joining the call of progressive Israelis, progressive Zionist rabbis and organizations that are calling for a bilateral ceasefire, release of all the hostages, desperately needed humanitarian aid for the people in Gaza, whose lives literally depend on it. I am, and I will be urging our American leadership to do everything in its power to bring about a negotiated end to the war and to lay the groundwork, even to force the hand of failed leadership on both sides for the possibility of autonomy and freedom for both peoples. In the spirit of Moses, who not only gave a final number, but took the community through a painstaking, well, hopefully mine's not painstaking, a step-by-step breakdown to allow for more clarity and trust, I want today to share at least a window into my own self-accounting, to give and to help you gain insight into where I am coming from, the core struggles and beliefs that have led me to this moment, so that we understand each other and do not make false assumptions of the other, which is all too much happening in the world we live in, based on this polarization. And in part, I want to model the struggle, not necessarily the conclusions, but the struggle of those who are trying to balance our commitments to Israel and the Jewish people alongside our commitments to our fellow human beings, both of which are core Jewish values. And to that end, before I take you on some of that step by step, I want to acknowledge and just name a few important things. Number one, I am not sharing with you today to convince you. I am not sharing with you to even necessarily influence you. And I am certainly not sharing to dictate SAJ policy. SAJ is a diverse community with many different views. And while I do feel an obligation to speak my own as the leader, I do not pretend to think I speak on behalf of this diverse congregation. On that note, I am going to do my very best to speak personally and not to overly moralize and stand on a soapbox. But as you know, this is not easy for rabbis. So I beg your forgiveness if I do that. And my third, a request. I may have already had you at hello or lost you at hello, I don't know. But there are some of you that may really, really disagree with me. And some of you who have disagreed with me earlier. And I just want to ask that we conjure up the image that I spoke about last Shabbat and in the newsletter of the cherry beam that face each other. The fact that God can only come through when we face one another and see each other. If you disagree or feel threatened, understandably, or scared by anything I'm saying, or let's not turn away. Let's use this opportunity to face each other. And while because of the sensitive nature of this drash, I'm not going to open up for discussion. My door is open, my email is open, Kiddush is open, although I have a little less time at Kiddush. So please know that this is not the end, but a beginning of conversation. And my last disclaimer is that I will probably cry, as I already mentioned. So I'm going to take us a little bit on an accounting of the last few months, self-accounting of the last few months, with a few touch points. October 6th and October 7th. On October 6th, I might have described my relationship to Israel as one of a loved but distant cousin. Maybe one I even got a little bit of a fight with that never got fully resolved. I felt a deep sense of love, but it was complicated. I had spent a full year in my life in my 20s in Israel, several summers in my 20s up until my 30s, and I loved being there. I loved living there. But I also had spent time with human rights activists, touring the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and that was already 20 years ago. And I needed space, and I was dealing with the reality of raising children, moving to New York, and the trip to Israel kept getting postponed and postponed. And I finally had tickets to go to Israel with my kids, and the tickets were for June, July, guess what year? 2020. So to suffice it to say, that trip did not happen. To my own somewhat surprise, on October 7th, it was as if I felt no distance at all. I was overcome with shock, grief, and rage. As I have spoken about the extent and the brutality of the attacks, I felt like I had experienced a secondary or third level of trauma myself, as I kept learning congregants and friends and loved ones who had people in Israel who had been killed or had been taken hostage. The fact that people were so ruthlessly killed, the fact that so many people who were killed were the most peace-loving people in Israel, the kind that we rarely see in Israeli society today, or at least not enough of, people who want to live near the borders, to drive Palestinians to the hospital and to do whatever they can within the system to make things better. People like Vivian Silver, may her memory be for a blessing. I felt like Hamas did not want to just kill people, but they wanted to kill the very idea that we could ever live in peace and coexistence, which is a core value of mine. And then, as so many others have reported, came another level of trauma that on 10/7, before Israel had ever even had any response, there were people who did not just provide context, but justified, rationalized, and downplayed the horrific attacks. And then there were those who celebrated them. And that is a conversation for another time, but it speaks to the pain of that moment. As I believed then and still believed, after these atrocities, Israel had a right to respond, and some kind of response was justified. Murder, rape, and kidnapping of civilians are war crimes, and no other nation would be expected not to do something. While I never believed it was possible to fully exterminate Hamas, I did think enough could be done to damage and to remove them from leadership, which I believe is good for everyone. Okay, next place. End of November. The end of November brought a temporary ceasefire and a release of hostages. It was for me among the most excruciating weeks of my life. I was glued to multiple news sources, which I had taken to reading daily since October 7th, feeling this incredible sense of peoplehood and connection to Israeli citizens. I saw the kidnapped as members of my own family. I knew their names, I knew their stories. And during that week, I chatted with my friends in Israel on a daily basis, hearing things that were not necessarily known to us in America. The will and the will they or the won't they of the release, the continual delays, staged pictures of women smiling who soon we found out were continuously assaulted throughout their time there. I was overcome with emotions, and I was feeling every single one. But in that week, I kept hoping, I kept believing and hoping that this would be it. More hostages would get released until all came home. Israel would stop their campaign of bombardment, and the killing of innocents would stop. I prayed harder in my life than I think I've ever had, well, with maybe one or two exceptions. And when the ceasefire ended and the hostages that remained were going to be left to an unknown fate, and I saw the war continuing, I went into the lowest place I'd ever been in a long time. I cried multiple times a day, and I could not sleep. I got so low that my husband told me that I had to change the way I was relating to this conflict for the sake of my own mental health. I could no longer consume media at the pace that I was. I could no longer be so vulnerable, so that every single hostage made my functionality of the day possible or impossible. And let me be really clear, because I'm sure we've all been in moments like that, not necessarily in this conflict. It is not fun to hear that. It is not enjoyable to be told you got to get your act together. But he was right. I couldn't stay in that place. Third place. End of December and early January. After taking some time to reset and recover, I found that the new year was bringing me new perspectives on the war, and a little distance was helping me find new paths. First, I had started to really become more emotionally connected to the toll on Palestinian civilians and the humanitarian crisis that was growing each day. I, of course, knew, I felt empathetic, but I don't think I let it in until then. And of course, we know the statistics now, over 30,000 dead, some of whom are Hamas, but many are not, or the majority are not, who knows, many are women and children. 70% of housing leveled. But it was not just the numbers, but the images, the humans. I am a realist, I want to say, and I know that sometimes in war there are civilian casualties. But I reached a point that, and I'm not exactly sure when I knew this was just, I didn't feel comfortable anymore. And the second piece was I started to ask whether this war, alongside the fanning of the flames and violence and aggression in the West Bank, was actually going to make Israel safe in the long run. I began to be more critical of the slogan of the war, total victory, which scholars and writers have pointed out, when you have a victory that is so big and so nebulous, you never know when you're going to win, and you never know when you're going to stop. And I felt more and more that this was just a recipe for constant, endless conflict. I've never been shy about my feelings toward Netanyahu and his self-serving ways, but really thinking about how he could be using this war for his own political gain. I mean, after all, what other good human being would not have seen the atrocities of October 7th and said, I will step aside? I don't trust, well, okay, you get the idea. But even as I started to move in this direction, and I started to feel like I could no longer be where I was, I didn't really tell that many people. I didn't tell the congregation. And I think it was for a few reasons. The first is I don't want to hurt people that I love. I have friends with children in the military in Israel. I have friends who've made Aliyah, and I didn't want to hurt them. And if people saw earlier, there was a group of like a minion of Israelis that walked in today, and I burst into tears thinking I was going to give this drash in front of them because I didn't want to hurt those random strangers who might not understand where I'm coming from. And the second reason I think I held back is because I didn't want to be lumped in with the people who have been calling for a ceasefire in a one-sided way, only calling for a ceasefire as if Israel was the only one while Hamas was still continuing to send rockets into Israel, who didn't criticize Hamas at all, who didn't seem to care about Israeli citizens. And because nothing seemed further from the truth, I have reached this point because I care so much about Israel's future, and I no longer believe this is the path for security. As activists in Israel from Standing Together say, the day after the war is today. Our actions today determine the future. So I began asking myself, is what's happening leading closer to that vision or further from it? How are we going to measure? It's one thing to have safety from an immediate threat, but what about the long-term prospect for peace? Because without it, I don't even know what we do. Is Israel safer if it continually goes against the international community, even now going against its greatest ally? And while eliminating or minimizing a threat, I believe wholeheartedly that the only long-term solution for peace is a negotiated two-state solution, even if you have to force the player's hand as much as possible. And even if people say that's no longer possible, I'm going to want to try my best to believe that that is still possible. 4. Rafah, February 2024 until now. Despite my concerns and struggles, I feel like I can no longer hold back and deny my perspective. Israel is poised to make a ground invasion into Rafah, where virtually everyone who has survived in Gaza and escaped to is there. Just yesterday, Netanyahu greenlighted a plan for such an invasion. And yes, there are some that say this is just posturing for negotiations, and there are others that say that Israel won't invade until people get the chance to escape. I don't know if these things are true or not, but I am scared. I am beyond words scared. I am scared for Palestinians. I am scared at the potential catastrophic loss of life. I am scared for Israel if this were to come to pass. Most Israelis are not even seeing the images or the facts on the ground. They don't necessarily even know what's really happening. I am so scared that this will forever alter the relationship, which is clearly already changing between the United States and Israel to a point that it might never recover from. And much like with the judicial coup a year ago, I am scared that this might change everything and further divide our Jewish community into corners. I am scared for all this and more. But despite being scared, this time I'm not going to be silent. If an invasion comes to pass, I'm going, well, now and until whenever, I'm going to speak out against it. As I said in the beginning, Moses makes this incredible and surprising decision to bring a full accounting for the people for the sake of transparency and trust. In doing so, Moses demonstrates his understanding that he is accountable to the community. He might have a slightly more influential boss, but he is ultimately beholden to the people. And as a rabbi, I know Moses' stance and self-understanding of himself and his role is the right model. As a rabbi, I am called to speak moral truths that I believe are right. But at the same time, I am accountable to this congregation, this community. My first and foremost responsibility is to be here for all of you, to hold all of you, every single one of you, with kavod, with honor, to strive to see your pain, your compassion, your passion, whether we agree or not, whether we apply our values in the same way or not. And to hold this incredible, diverse community together, to create a space unlike any other in the world today, where we face each other like the cherubim, and we allow God to dwell in the space of meeting. And that is the most incredible sacred responsibility. And I thank each and every one of you for trusting me with that task. But this work is not mine alone. It is aleinu, it is on all of us. So let us continue to invite all of us in this challenging, countercultural, at least in this moment, work of building sacred community that can hold all of us, that can see all of us, that can honor our pain and our vulnerability. And as Moses looked up at what he had created and what they were creating together and saw it and said it was a blessing, so too may we see what we are doing together as a blessing to us, to the Jewish people, and to the world. Shabbat shalom.